The case that we have for you today is not just a case, it's a saga. This is a story of not one murder, it's a story of 12. 21-year-old American woman drugged and drowned in Bangkok. Turkish man found doused in gasoline and burnt to death near Pattaya. Dutch couple found drugged and strangled and burnt alive in Thailand. And the countless news reports of dead or missing foreign nationals just wouldn't stop. This is the story of one man behind these killings, and it's the story of the one man that uncovered it all. This is the story of Charles Sobhraj. Hi everyone, welcome to the Desi Crime Podcast, a show where we dive deep into some of the craziest cases from around South Asia. I'm your host Aishwarya.
And I'm Aryaan.
And the case that I have for you today is one that terrorized the people of so many countries for so long.
The last couple of years, our feeds have been filled with shots of Sobhraj in Paris, shots of Sobhraj outside the Big Ben. And people know of this character, of who he was, of this, prolific and infamous serial killer.
Yep.
Not many know of what exactly went down.
Right.
Who exactly is Sobhraj and why the infamy? Where does it stem from?
And who are the individual people that got affected by this?
Nobody knows their stories.
And that was one of the challenges covering this case, Aryaan, is that it's going to be an episode which will cover 12 different cases. How do I bring out the individual stories of each of these 12? And that's been an effort throughout this case.
It's easy to think of 12 as a statistic, but when you break down into individual cases, you remember these are people that
Real
lost
people
their life
like us.
in very tragic, eerie and mysterious circumstances.
Absolutely. And Aryaan, before we get on with the story of these 12 people, I just want to request all of our listeners to go subscribe to this channel for more insane stories like these. So many of you aren't actually subscribed.
Yeah, I want you guys to become a statistic of the subscriber count.
Absolutely.
Not the wrong kind of victim count.
We like.
The kind of statistic we like, and we need that, The more subscribers we have, the more validation we have to continue producing these episodes.
Stories,
so like us, heart us, show me, just validate us.
Wow, weird.
Okay.
We're beginning this episode in an iconic period of history. In fact, I'll ask Aryaan this question only because I know the answer to this question when I ask him it. If you could be born in any era across history, what would it be?
Late 60s, early 70s.
Early 70s. Why?
Yeah, I mean, you know the answer,
Yeah.
but I don't know if you saw the glimmer in my eyes when we covered the Osho episode, and we got so many comments about people being, Aryaan, we thought he was smarter than wanting to join Osho's clan/cult, but I think my temperament is one that gravitates me towards the hippie movement.
Yeah.
Not cults, I wouldn't have gone to Jonestown Massacre.
Sure.
But no, definitely the hippie culture has a pull. I don't know, sort of the free love environment and just free play and liberty.
Drugs, the promiscuity, it's all.
What are you talking about? It's so much more than that.
Totally. No, but I ask you this question because that's exactly where we're beginning this case. For this case, I'm taking you to the 70s. The 70s were insane. For the 20 years before then, beginning in the 1950s, a counterculture had started to emerge in the Western world. A culture of psychedelic music, a culture of sexual revolution and liberation, a culture heavy on drug use and heavy on Eastern philosophy, a culture many believe was the way to spiritual enlightenment. By the time the 70s rolled around, this culture, the hippie culture, was in full swing. During this 20-year span, thousands and thousands of Western youngsters, people our age, packed a backpack, hopped onto a bus and flocked to countries like India, Nepal, Thailand and Indonesia through a route that came to be called the hippie trail. Now make no mistake, this wasn't a culture of degenerate young children only obsessed with drugs, sex and partying. Members of this culture actively followed Hindu and Buddhist religious philosophies as a means to spiritual freedom, and many of them went on to work at ashrams and monasteries across Asia. Take absolutely any famous Western musicians of this time period, and chances are they were all influenced by and active participants in the hippie movement. The Beatles were icons of the hippie movement and considered themselves to be hippies too. They traveled to India often and stayed at an ashram in Rishikesh all throughout their career. From Jimi Hendrix to the Grateful Dead, from Stevie Wonder to Bob Dylan, each of these artists was a hippie icon and actively participated in the culture. But there was a small problem. These Westerners, unaware of the culture and the land that they were entering, unable to speak local languages, would sometimes end up disappearing. In a time before the internet, before smartphones or video calling, their families had no idea what happened to these kids. Were they killed or simply joined an ashram and refused to contact their families? There was no way of knowing. So this is where we're beginning. 1976. Thailand in 1976. Bangkok, Thailand's capital, was a hustling and bustling city, a city of tourists, many of whom were these hippies. The city was full of the Dutch, the French, the American. It was a breeding ground of hippie culture. Living in Bangkok during this time was a couple that was about to make history. This couple was Dutchman Herman Knippenberg and his German wife Angela Knippenberg. Herman was a 31-year-old young, hardworking and honest Dutch diplomat working at the Dutch embassy in Bangkok. Angela wasn't just Herman's wife living in his shadows. She was and is even today in many ways more remarkable than any of the people we've covered on this podcast. She spoke 6 languages, she got her degree from Bryn Mawr College and the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and by the 1960s was working with the World Bank in Washington, D.C. She then joined the UN Secretariat in 1977 and eventually was the UN High Representative for Disarmament Affairs. But this tiny list doesn't even begin to explain the work she's done. You're looking for inspiring women? Go read up about her. But that's past the point. The point is that Angela and Herman were a deeply loving couple, both incredible in their own ways, who had moved together to Thailand in an exciting and new phase of their life. The calm and peace of their happy lives in a new country was disturbed on the 6th of February 1976 when Herman received a letter on his work desk. The letter was from a Dutchman who was writing to the Dutch embassy in desperation, pleading for help. He had every reason to be desperate too. His sister-in-law, Cornelia Hemke, and her boyfriend, Hernicus Bintania, who had left to travel on the hippie trail, hadn't written to their families in 6 weeks. According to the letter, this wasn't normal. Cornelia and Hernicus would write to them very regularly since they had left for this trip. In fact, they wrote a letter twice every week. But for the last 6 weeks, there was complete silence. Hernicus was 29 years old, and even though he had a master's degree in chemistry, he had struggled these last few years getting a job or getting into a good med school. Cornelia was a 25-year-old nurse, and according to the lineup, her blonde hair and blue eyes made her a poster for all things Dutch. The two lived a simple and happy life together in a small and comfortable house where the two cooked a lot together, they rode their bike around town together, sometimes they smoked up, and even though life was difficult, they were figuring it out together. They were crazy about each other. But slowly, Hernicus, who was lovingly called Henk, grew more and more frustrated by his inability to find work. The finances were getting to the couple. There wasn't enough money to keep afloat. In quintessential young person style, when the couple began to feel overly burdened by their situation, they decided to travel the world. The two began working extra to collect enough money to just, excuse my language, off far, far away from the problems of the real world. In fact, shortly before the couple left on their journey, Henk told Benjamin, his best friend, quote, "We'll probably regret this, but we're going to spend every dime we have. But if we don't do it now, we never will." End quote. Benjamin agreed. "Don't look back," he said. "This trip is something everybody would like to do. It will pay itself back in 1,000 unknown ways." End quote. The couple began their travels, going from one country to another, finally ending up in Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, on the busy market streets, the couple made a friend. This friend was a man named Alain Gauthier, a Frenchman from Bangkok who was in Hong Kong for business. Alain was a man of mixed race, just like Henk, and the two bonded over the discrimination they had faced in majority white countries. Henk was half Dutch and half Indonesian, while Alain was half Vietnamese and half Indian, but grew up in France. They both came to understand each other. Alain was also wealthy in the exact ways that Henk and Cornelia wished to be. He took them out to lunch at the Hyatt Regency and walks down the most expensive streets of the city where shops were decorated with jewels. He took them across Victoria Harbour on the world's best ferry ride. He invited them to his hotel room in the city, where he offered them imported whiskey and beer that the couple drank for free. It made sense that Allah was this wealthy. He was a gem dealer after all. In fact, Henk confided in Allah about how crazily in love with Cornelia he was. He was thinking of proposing, but all the rings he had liked in Hong Kong were too expensive for him to afford. And Allah, who by this time had become very close to the couple, offered to procure a sapphire ring from his own private collection and sell it to the couple for just $1,600, less than half the cost of a sapphire ring on the market at the time. Allah introduced the couple to his wife too, a gorgeous Canadian woman named Monique. Cornelia and Monique grew closer, and so did Allah and Henk. Eventually, Henk proposed to Cornelia in front of his two close friends with the ring that they had sold to them. Cornelia wrote of their new friends in the letters that she wrote back to her family in Holland. Quote, "Our new friend's name is Allah, and he's invited us to visit him in Bangkok." End quote. Shortly after that, the letters stopped. The couple did reach Bangkok. There was record of that, but they never checked into the hotel they had booked. Which is why Cornelia's brother-in-law wrote to the Dutch embassy in Bangkok, asking, pleading for help in finding the two. Herman Knippenberg was adamant on helping the family find their children, but when he told the higher-ups at the embassy of the missing couple, nobody seemed to care. This was the problem of the foreigners on the hippie trail. The Dutch ambassador, who, for the lack of a better word, can be considered Herman's boss, told Herman exactly that. Their disappearance wasn't uncommon. In fact, many times they disappeared and joined cults or religious institutions out of their own free will. The embassies were sick of these cases. They had to focus their resources on matters more important than young people on drugs who had forgotten that there was a real world out there, he told Herman. The hippies were a pain to these diplomats. This ambassador that Herman went to for help was obviously frustrated. To explain this frustration, he told Herman a story. A few weeks ago, two dead bodies of a man and a woman were found about 80 kilometers north of Bangkok. The Australian embassy was informed of these bodies because the Australian embassy was in search of a missing Australian couple on the hippie trail who were last seen in Bangkok. The bodies were set on fire while the couple was still alive. Their faces were disfigured and the case was tragic. The Australian authorities assumed these dead bodies to be of the missing Australian couple, Johnson and Rosanna Watson. They informed the families and began their verification process. But in the middle of all of that, Johnson and Rosanna Watson just showed up. They had been living in isolation, high on drugs, and then they suddenly decided to return. The point this ambassador was trying to make was, irresponsible hippie kids waste government resources, worry their own families, and end up taking public money all for nothing.
Did it for a second strike that this couple could have been the couple he was looking for?
It's about to strike him, yes.
Okay.
Like Aryaan said, all Herman heard from this story was, this means there are two dead bodies in a morgue in Bangkok that are unidentified and could be Henk and Cornelia. Herman knew exactly what he had to do. He found a Dutch dentist in Bangkok willing to help him, and he gave him the dental records of Henk and Cornelia. He instructed the dentist to visit the burnt bodies in the morgue and see if by some long shot of fate, this could be their bodies. The dentist did as instructed and called Herman at his office a few days later. It's a match, he said. As Herman would begin the investigation into the deaths of Henk and Cornelia, little did he know just how many people had been disappearing in Bangkok over the last few months, and how many would continue to disappear. Teresa Knowlton was a beautiful 21-year-old from Seattle in the United States who had come to Bangkok in 1975, a year before Henk and Cornelia had, after being heavily influenced by Buddhist philosophy. She wanted to travel all the way to Kathmandu to study at a Tibetan monastery in Kopan. But before she became a monk in Nepal, she wanted to enjoy her last few weeks as a young 21-year-old during her travels. That was the deal she had with herself. She'll party and she'll have sex and meet new people on the way to Nepal. But once she reached the monastery, she'd leave that life behind to find a greater purpose, to find enlightenment. In Bangkok, Teresa made friends with other backpackers, all of whom would party and do drugs together every evening. On one of those evenings, these backpackers invited Teresa to a poolside party at the residence of a wealthy gem salesman and his wife living in Bangkok, a man named Ala Gautier. This man was warm and welcoming, charming and charismatic. He had a reputation for inviting young backpackers to his lavish bungalow called Kanith House and let them have a good time before they left Bangkok. Teresa was excited. She did go to Kanith House that night for the party. She drank, she danced, she had fun, and she was never heard from ever again. On the 18th of October 1975, just a few days after Teresa went to the party, her body was found floating in the Gulf of Thailand in nothing but a bikini. It was obvious this was a murder, not an accidental drowning. Teresa was drugged with a highly sedative drug called Largactil, used to treat severe depression, and while she was still alive, she was drowned. While alarm was being raised in Bangkok over the body of Teresa, and while the local newspapers began to talk of a bikini killer on the loose, a young Turkish man named Vitaly Hakim was planning a trip to Thailand.
I never knew that's where the term bikini killer comes from. I never even thought about it.
And this was just the first of many bodies that would go on to be found this way.
With just a bikini
on, yeah. Vitaly Hakim was a drug trader coming to Bangkok to conduct drug sales among a market of hippies. He knew this is where the drug industry was booming. He left behind Charmaine, the French woman he loved, and the daughter that he had had with her to go to Bangkok just for a few weeks. He told them he'd be back soon. But Charmaine never heard from Hakim ever again. Her daughter never saw her father ever again. When weeks passed and Hakim didn't return, Charmaine left her daughter with her mother and booked a flight to Bangkok to find the man she loved. She knew where Hakim had last been. He had written to her from there. He said he had made friends with a couple in Bangkok, gem dealer Aryaan Gautier and his wife Monique. The two had been nice to him. They had invited him over to their gorgeous home called Kanith House. They had offered him free food and alcohol and a place to stay if he needed it. And so Charmaine went to Kanith House the second she arrived in Bangkok.
Okay, Ash, Aryaan Gautier, the gem dealer, right?
Yeah.
Do we know anything about Monique at this point? This woman, who is
she? She seems almost as mystical as Aryaan does at this point, right? And we're going to get to her life and her story.
Okay, please tell me. Give me a little. What do we know?
Canadian woman, beautiful.
So Quebecois.
Yes, absolutely. French speaking, gorgeous woman, madly in love with Aryaan.
That's all you tell me?
Yes, that's all I'll tell you. So Charmaine, when she arrived in Bangkok, actually met Monique and the women talked. She told Monique she was looking for her husband and asked if she knew where he was. Then entered Aryaan. Aryaan and Monique told Charmaine they had met Hakim. He had come over for a party, but they hadn't seen him since then. They had no information of help that they could offer her. They could only comfort her and be her friends in this time of need while she searched for Hakim. Aryaan offered Charmaine a cup of tea. Charmaine drank it, and nobody heard from Charmaine ever again. Her mother waited and waited and waited for her daughter to return. Her young daughter waited for her mother to return and father to return, but they never did. Weeks later, Vitaly Hakim's body was found burnt and charred on a road in Pattaya. Shortly after that, Charmaine's body was found floating on the gorgeous waters of the Gulf of Thailand, the exact place where Teresa Knowlton's body was found.
What I'm unable to understand is that these bodies are being found burnt. And like, if a body's being found drowned, I understand that it's been disposed of in a water body.
Sure.
But being burnt and charred feels sadistic to a degree, because if you want to get rid of a body and you're burning it, then you should just burn to the point that no remains remain, right?
But there are the remains.
I do we know why? Do we know what's
don't.
the intention of the killer or whatever's been?
We don't, and what we're seeing here is a little bit of a pattern that hasn't fully materialized yet, but all the women are found in water and all the men are charred and their bodies are found in this like semi-burnt state. So I think that's just like
And do we know if they were being set on fire or burnt while they were alive, sedated?
Yeah, so the first couple we know they were burnt while they were alive, Now we're at 1976. By this time, Teresa, Vitaly, Charmaine, Henk and Cornelia have all been found dead. Their one connection, their one common denominator is their encounter with the wealthy gem dealer Aryaan Gautier and his wife Monique. It's almost as if Kanith House had become the Bermuda Triangle for wandering tourists. They would come, they would write to their families of these amazing new friends they've made, and then they would vanish. Weeks later, their bodies would be found. The men would be found burnt alive, the women drowned alive. All bodies would show the remnant of some drug, either the strong sedative Largactil or the strong antacid kaopectate or the hypnotic drug Mogadon or the illegal drug Quaaludes. These were 5 deaths. But how come nobody was drawing a connection? Why was nobody going to the cops? How was Herman Knippenberg, actively working on the deaths of Henk and Cornelia, unable to realize there were other murders of the same nature that all led back to the same man, Aryaan Gautier? These are all valid questions, but there is one very simple answer to each and every one of these questions. For long after these people disappeared, it seemed like they were still alive. Their passports continued to be used. There were records of all of these people leaving Bangkok. For example, Henk and Cornelia were recorded leaving Bangkok just 2 days after Herman received the letter about their disappearance. This wasn't all. All of these travelers had something called a traveler's check in their names. They withdrew a traveler's check from their own countries for a specific amount of money, and when they arrived in Bangkok, they took this traveler's check to a bank which gave them that money but in local currency for them to use.
Ash, I have never used a traveler's check.
Me
but
neither.
I'm assuming there is some sort of identity required to encash them,
Correct.
right?
Absolutely, yeah.
I mean, I just can't show up with a traveler's check on your name and say, hey, give me
This is
$1,000
mine,
bucks.
yeah. Correct.
So then,
So the assumption is that these people were alive.
I mean, it makes sense.
It makes sense, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. Multiple banks in Bangkok had records of the travelers' checks of Teresa and Henk and Cornelia and Vitali being withdrawn much after they had supposedly disappeared. This to the local cops could mean only one thing. These people were alive. They were leaving and entering Thailand. They were withdrawing money. They were simply refusing to contact their families back home. And like I've said so many times before in this episode already, this kind of behavior wasn't unusual. This was the problem of hippie travel. This was a problem for Herman too. He was realizing there was something fishy about all of these bodies showing up, but going to the local authorities was useless till he had better proof that the people whose bodies were being found were actually the people he was claiming them to be. He needed more evidence, heaps and heaps more of evidence, and this evidence came in the form of one person, Nadine Gier, Aryaan and Monique's close friend and neighbor. If Herman and his wife Angla are one pair of heroes in the story, Nadine Gier and her husband Remy Gier are another. Originally from Normandy in France, Nadine and Remy had moved to Bangkok for Remy's work as a chef. They had ended up purchasing the apartment right across the Kanith house and slowly over the years become very close friends with Aryaan and his wife. Nadine has since come forward to say that Aryaan always terrified her, but Monique almost seemed like a victim, a meek woman in Alain's shadows. Nadine herself was incredibly lonely. Her husband worked long hours, was hardly ever home, and she needed friends. In this rough time, Alain's charm and charisma and Monique's welcoming comfort drew Nadine to the couple. Nadine became one of the insiders. She became friends with all of the members of the Kanith house, not just Aryaan and Monique. You see, not just Aryaan and Monique lived in the Kanith house, but also Alain's right-hand man, an Indian man named Ajay Chaudhary, and the couple's house help, a young 19-year-old French boy who was always in poor health, named Dominique. The dynamics of the house were weird, with all of these people living under the same roof. There always seemed to be friction between Monique and Ajay, but both Nadine and Monique had a soft spot for Dominique. In fact, Nadine actually came to develop a close friendship with Dominique. And this friendship reached its closest when Monique, Ajay and Aryaan left the house with Dominique and went for a vacation. Thinking Dominique was alone in the house, Nadine and Remy decided to visit him to make sure he was doing fine, since ever since Dominique had arrived in Bangkok, he had been incredibly unwell. It is on that visit that Nadine and Remy realized that they had been partying with, living with, hanging out with a group of murderers. Dominique tells Nadine and Remy the harrowing story of how he ended up in Alain's house and why he is unable to leave. Dominique had left his family back in France to travel the world alone. He worked on a cruise ship for a while before he ended up in Bangkok, figuring out his next move to earn more money while also being able to travel. It was in Bangkok that he met Aryaan and Monique. The couple invited Dominique over for dinner and asked him if he's okay helping the couple out with everyday errands in the house in exchange for a place to live. Dominique obviously said yes. The opportunity of a free apartment just to help out with household errands, it was perfect. He could save up some money by taking up another job, and soon enough, he could move on to his next travel expedition or maybe go back home to his parents, who he was now beginning to miss. But that dinner is the last memory Dominique has of himself not being unwell. The next morning, Dominique wakes up in Alain's residence and he couldn't stop throwing up. Aryaan and Monique comfort him, tell him he's sick, but that the doctors in Bangkok were useless. It was better if the couple cured Dominique in the house itself. It had been 3 months to that. Since then, Dominique had lost so much weight, his ribcage stuck out of his skin. He threw up almost every day and showed no sign of recovery. But by this time, Aryaan gained Dominique's trust. He became Dominique's confidant. Dominique couldn't think of questioning him. However, as time went on, Dominique noticed a pattern. Foreign travelers would come to the Kanith house, the couple would feed them food and give them drinks. The travelers would fall sick in ways remarkably similar to those of Dominique. They would faint, sweat, throw up, complain of a stomachache. Aryaan and Monique would promise to nurse them back to health, and then these people would disappear. Dominique had personally watched Teresa get sick and then disappear. He had watched Hakeem get sick and then disappear. He had watched Henk and Cornelia get sick and then disappear. On multiple nights, he had woken up to the sound of Allah and Ajay carrying someone down the stairs out of the house. And every time he was told that they were taking a sick backpacker to the hospital. That backpacker was never seen again.
So, Aishwarya, I mean, from whatever we have deduced, right, Allah is a clinical killer.
Right.
Is what I seem to gather.
Correct.
Or at least a clinical kidnapper at the very least.
Right.
Whatever you've revealed. Why would he go on a vacation when he knows people know that Dominique is home alone? Is this a mistake? Is this his first mistake? In many.
I think it ends up being so, but I don't think he quite realized that. To him, he had gained the trust of this 19-year-old who was sick and had nowhere else to go, no money to be able to leave. And you'll see also the documentation that Dominique would have needed to escape the country if he wanted to was all in Allah's clutches. So I don't think he quite assumed that anyone.
So he assumed that
out.
Dominique is not going to snitch on him.
Yep. As Dominique noticed this pattern, he slowly stopped taking the medication the couple had been feeding him, and slowly his health became better. As Dominique is narrating the story to Nadine and Remy, the couple has chills running down their spine. They cannot fathom what they're hearing, but hearing it out loud almost makes it make sense. They ask Dominique why he hasn't run away yet, like Aryaan asked, and a crying, sobbing Dominique tells them that he can't. He has no form of identification and no money to use for even a bus ticket. He came to Bangkok with his passport, which Allah kept in a safe inside the house, and Dominique has never seen since. Nadine and Remy knew they needed to help their friend. They had to save him before he ended up dead and burnt on the side of some Bangkok street. They promised him they'd buy him a flight ticket back to France, but they needed to find his passport before they could do that. The three began searching the house for the key to the safe, and after hours of searching, they find it.
Wow.
They open the safe and they can't believe what they see inside. Inside is not just Dominique's passport, there's the passports of so many travelers that had stopped over at the Kanith house, so many of whom they now assumed were dead. But this wasn't all. As they picked up Dominique's passport and opened it, they realized the photograph inside was not Dominique's at all. It was Allah's. He had been using the passports of the people he had been keeping captive or killing and traveling on them to evade the police and conceal his identity. Allah was committing fraud so complicated and so thought out, it would require the coming together of police forces of so many countries in one collaborated mission to catch him. Far from that, Allah wasn't even on anyone's radar at this point. But now he was, on Nadine and Remy's. The couple spent the rest of the night cutting out Allah's picture from the passport and putting Dominique's back in place. They then realized Dominique's visa to stay in Bangkok had expired. If the airport authorities saw that, they'd put him in prison and Allah would come get him and then definitely murder him. So they took out one of the many other passports from inside the safe, cut out a valid visa from it and attached it to Dominique's passport.
Aishwarya, what were passports like back in the 70s and 80s?
I know. You guys have to look it up. It's actually wild how shaky and flimsy the documents seem. And I think it's not even so much what the passport looked like, but how much did security forces actually care?
Care about, I mean, we especially Indians, I think, we have a certain, we venerate the passport.
Right.
You know, we all keep it in the safest place in our
Absolutely.
homes. It's encased within so many things. It's in a leather pouch.
Yeah.
It's a very important document because we need a visa to go anywhere.
Right.
How is he cutting out a visa and just slapping it onto a passport and traveling?
And it's not just Dominique who's doing it. Clearly, you can tell that Allah has been traveling on these passports.
Yeah, so there are many countries that allow this sort of
behavior.
Lacune in their system.
Yep, absolutely.
Wow.
And we've talked about this before on the podcast that post 9/11, pre 9/11 travel is vastly different.
Right.
This is like the 1970s.
Oh yeah.
That's like
This is
30 years
anything.
before that.
Fair.
Now, as shaky as this plan was, it was either this or nothing. It was either this or Dominique's death. The passport looked real, so did the visa. They booked Dominique a flight to France for that night, called him a cab and hugged him goodbye. They told him to write to them from France just so they knew that he's safe, and Dominique agreed. That night marked the beginning of the end for Allah. But did Dominique get back safe? Did Nadine and Remy ever get a letter from him, or did someone catch him at the airport? What was going to happen when Allah, Monique and Ajay returned and realized Dominique was gone? Would they figure out it was Nadine and Remy and kill them too? Wait, who is Allah? Who is Monique? Are they just committing murder after murder after murder for small amounts of money in the forms of travelers' checks from hippie children and for the sake of faking passports? Where is Herman's investigation leading him? I know you're all thinking these questions, and I have your answers. They booked Dominique a flight to France for that night, called him a cab and hugged him goodbye. They told him to write to them from France just so they know he's safe, and Dominique agreed. But Dominique wasn't the only person that escaped that night. Along with him, 2 other people that Aryaan had kept captive also escaped. Not much information is available on the other 2, and so we don't know the details of who they were and where they are, but Dominique for sure escaped. In France, he met his parents again and he began a long process of healing from what he had just managed to come out of. He was so close to being killed. He had been made sick for so many months now. He was certain he had witnessed the beginnings of multiple murders of innocent young people just like him. He needed the healing. But Dominique wrote to Nadine and Remy, thanking them for saving his life. He would never forget what the 2 had done for him. That night, the night that Dominique and the 2 others escaped, marked the beginning of the end for Aryaan. But now let's get back to Herman and his own personal investigation. An investigation he's conducting by going against what all of his superiors at the Dutch embassy want him to do. But an investigation that Herman believes he has to take on. An investigation he can't simply ignore for the sake of respecting his seniors. An investigation he as a human being must conduct so that countless parents can have the peace of knowing how their child died and find the hope of possible justice. But as of now, Herman doesn't know of the previous murders. All he knows are the stories of Henk and Cornelia. By this time, Herman has sent the letters that Henk and Cornelia had written to their families. Those letters clearly mentioned the couple meeting a wealthy gem dealer named Aryaan who they had befriended. Herman knew he needed to begin looking for this gem dealer. On one random night in 1967, while his investigation is still ongoing, Herman is out eating dinner with a friend. This friend is Belgian diplomat Paul Simons. As Herman is telling Paul of his investigation and the man he's trying to find, Paul's facial expression begins to change. He looks shocked, almost as though he has something to tell Herman the moment Herman completes his next statement. Paul begins to tell Herman of a weird incident that had transpired at the French embassy a few weeks ago. A French woman had come to the French embassy crying and hysterical, claiming that she was neighbors with a gem dealer who she believed was committing not just financial fraud and identity theft, but was also a serial killer. The French embassy did exactly what the Dutch embassy would have done with the case of Henk and Cornelia had Herman not been there. They ignored it. They told this woman that her case was better suited for the local police. This woman told them she couldn't take it to the police. This gem dealer had connections with the local authorities, but the embassy said they could do nothing. But before leaving, this woman left with the embassy a diary belonging to a couple she believed had been killed by this man. Herman made his way to the French embassy the very next day and found the diary. When he opened it, he saw inside pictures of the 2 people he had been trying to bring justice to for the last many weeks. It was Henk's diary, with countless pictures of him and Cornelia. Inside the diary, however, was also a contact card. A card belonging to gem dealer Aryaan Gauthier with his exact Bangkok address on it. The address to Kanith House. Since Herman now had Alaa's address and he knew this woman was Alaa's neighbor, he ended up going to the house where this woman used to live, hoping she still lives there. He knocks on the front door and the door opens. Inside is the woman he was looking for. Inside was Nadine. He invites Nadine and her husband over to dinner at his house to discuss the claims she had made to the French embassy. Both the couples meet for dinner at the Knippenberg household where Nadine recounts her story to Herman and Angela. She tells them everything. She tells them how her loneliness led her to become friends with Aryaan and Monique. She tells them about Dominique and his escape. She tells them of the countless tourists she'd seen coming into Kanith House, whose belongings, including their passports, are still inside that house, leading her to believe they were all killed. She tells them how she's continued to maintain her friendship with Aryaan and Monique so as to steal more and more evidence from the house and finally reach the truth of who these people are.
How long has it been since Nadine helped free Dominique and her meeting with...
This is all within the same month because we know that Nadine figured all this out, panicked and went to the embassy to try and say that there's something going wrong.
For her to still maintain friendship with somebody she knows is a serial killer is genuinely very brave.
These 2 couples are heroes in ways that I have not seen before in another true crime story.
It's scary to know that you're living beside a serial killer.
Yep. Just like Aryaan, Herman cannot believe the story he's just heard. What he assumed to be the murder of one couple has turned into a tale of a serial killer who shows no sign or reason for stopping. After hearing all of this, Herman knew he had found a partner for his investigation. Nadine and Herman devised a plan together. Nadine was going to be taking a camera into Kanith house the next time she was hanging out there. She was going to be taking pictures for them. In fact, not just pictures for and of them, Nadine was going to be sneaking into the rooms of Aryaan, Monique and Ajay and taking pictures of the evidence inside the house. The plan was solid, but incredibly, Herman later described it to be, quote, the most harrowing experience of his life. But it needed to be done. With all of these pictures, there should be enough evidence to prove to the cops that the man living inside Kanith house was a cold-blooded murderer. The plan worked out like Herman and Nadine wanted it to. Nadine snuck a camera into Kanith house for the first time ever and clicked numerous pictures of the people living inside. On a separate occasion, she snuck into the rooms and clicked pictures of the passports, the random everyday articles belonging to the young people who disappeared.
And again, this is 1970s?
70s, yeah.
She doesn't have a very savvy portable camera. I'm guessing she has
one of those huge box
big ass
thingies.
ones.
Yep.
This just corroborates. It requires a lot of bravery to do these things
Absolutely.
for people that are not your direct relatives. This is selfless.
Yep. Through the course of this individual investigation, it became obvious that more than the original 5 had been killed. In fact, 2 days after the bodies of Henk and Cornelia were identified, it was revealed by the airport authorities that someone had travelled on the couple's passport from Bangkok to Kathmandu. Both Aryaan and Monique had changed their identities into those of the couple they had just killed. In Kathmandu, the couple ended up making more new friends with young travellers. They made friends with a young Canadian woman named Laurent Carrier, who was 26 years old, and American Stanford University student Connie Jo Bronzik, who was 29. The couple killed the two and then stole their passports and entered Bangkok using them. So now, not only did it seem like Henk and Cornelia were alive much after they actually died, it also seemed like Laurent Carrier and Connie Jo Bronzik were alive much after they were.
So they aren't just murdering backpackers in Thailand.
No.
They are murdering them wherever the hell
All
they go.
All across the hippie trail, these multiple countries that sort of encompassed this movement, they're just traveling to these countries where they're committing murder after murder.
And if the investigation is at such a nascent stage in a place like Thailand, which still has more diplomats and dignitaries present.
Correct.
In Nepal, I'm guessing back in the 1970s,
nobody gives a shit. Yeah,
nobody knows.
Yeah, nobody knows. Like Aryaan said, all of this information was insane. It needed to be taken to the cops, the rightful owners of this information and executors of justice. And so Herman and Nadine did. They took this information to the local Thai cops. But the cops chose to take their own sweet time reviewing this information. On the morning of March 11th, 1976, Nadine here had some bad news for Herman. Aryaan and Monique were planning to go to Europe for some time. Herman alerted the police, leading the cops into sudden action, who ended up storming the Kanith house that evening and taking Aryaan, Monique and Ajay into their custody. Nadine and Remy breathed a sigh of relief. For once in weeks now, they didn't think their life was in danger. They felt one step closer to justice. But then, Herman's phone rang. Aryaan was released the evening of his arrest. He had an American passport, a passport belonging to one of his many victims now, and he used it to prove he wasn't in fact a French gem dealer and had come to Bangkok from America very recently. And since the passport of the victim was stamped for entry into Bangkok very recently, the cops believed his story. Just like today, producing your passport as a proof was the strongest metric of identification back then. This man wasn't the gem dealer from the letters, the cops had decided, and the 3 murderers were set free. Herman was done. He had fought tooth and nail to get this man behind bars, and all of this work, including putting Nadine's life in danger for the sake of evidence, all of this couldn't even keep this man in jail for a full day. The case had taken a toll on Herman's life. His mental health was in shambles, and his relationship with his wife was shakier than ever. He needed a vacation, and the embassy gave it to him. The Dutch ambassador gave him 3 weeks of leave. But before he left for his holiday with his wife, Herman and Angla compiled documents relating to the case, the Knippenberg Cache, as he called it, and dropped them off at embassies across Bangkok.
Wow.
According to CNN, when Herman returned home from his vacation, he received a call from the Canadian ambassador. The Canadian police had visited Monique's parents while Herman was away, and a few shocking details had since come to light. Monique's name wasn't Monique at all. It was Marie-Andre Leclerc. According to Leclerc's parents, their daughter had been traveling with her boyfriend and had left an emergency contact, a phone number from near Marseille, France. When the French police checked, they found it was the contact for Alain's mother. But Ala's mother wasn't Ala's mother. She was the mother of a man named Charles Sobhraj. But she said she knew Ala Gautier. It was one of the many, many, many names her son had used over the course of his criminal career. Sobhraj's mother tells the cops a tale of a twisted childhood and a life of theft and murder that was a long time in the making. Hochand Bhavani Gurmukh Charles Sobhraj was born in Saigon in Vietnam in 1944 to an Indian father and a Vietnamese mother. Charles's parents were never married, and after his birth, his father denied the possibility that Charles could be his son. Due to his mother's move to France and his father's denial to call Charles his own child, Charles was a stateless person for a good period of his childhood before his mother's new husband, a French army lieutenant stationed in French Indochina, decided to adopt Charles. This was a glimmer of hope for Charles, for that little kid. A happy home was seemingly on the way. But the reality was different. Charles's mother went on to have more children with her new husband, and Charles realized he was reduced to feeling second class and neglected in favor of these latter children. For the sake of earning his own money to gain some form of independence from what he considered to be a horrible household, Charles started to commit petty crimes as a teenager and was actually sent to jail for the very first time for burglary in 1963 in a prison in Paris. While he was in prison, Charles developed a certain kind of personality. He developed a charisma and a magnetism and a charm that he began to use to manipulate prison guards into granting him favors nobody else was being given. For example, Charles was allowed to keep books in his prison cell. It was around this time, while Charles was in prison, that he met and charmed a man named Felix d'Escone, who was a wealthy young man and a prison volunteer. After being released from prison, Charles moved in with Felix, and this is where he got in touch with the high society of Paris, while also committing crimes in the criminal underworld. He began to collect money and gems through theft and scams. It was in this phase of his life, in his early 20s, that Charles met a young Parisian woman named Chantal, and the two fell in love. The two dated, and eventually Charles asked her to marry him. Chantal said yes, but Charles was arrested later the same day for attempting to run away from Paris police while driving a stolen vehicle. He went to prison again for 8 months, but throughout this time, Chantal remained supportive of him and waiting for him to be released so the two could get married. 8 months later, the two were married, and by 1970, just 6 years before Henk and Cornelia disappeared, the two were expecting a baby. The same year, the two moved to Mumbai using fake documents where Charles continued his criminal lifestyle. He and Chantal ran a car theft and smuggling business and continued to rob young tourists for money despite the fact that they now had a baby daughter named Usha. Now, all of you that are from Delhi, I'm sure you know of Hotel Ashoka. It's a gorgeous 5-star very close to Connaught Place. In 1973, Charles planned an armed robbery of the jewelry store inside this incredibly fancy hotel, and regardless to say, the robbery was unsuccessful. He was arrested, and then he faked illness and was released again. He left India with his wife and now moved to Kabul. There he began robbing hippies that had come to Kabul on the hippie trail and was arrested again. But then he was released again. Then he fled to Iran, but this time leaving his family behind. His wife moved back to Paris, leaving their criminal past, and vowed to never see Charles again. It was now 1975. Since Iran, Charles had run away to Istanbul and then to Greece with his brother Andre. Both committed identity fraud in those two countries, which led to Andre going to prison for Charles's crime for 18 years. Charles fled and by 1975 found himself in Bangkok. During a short trip back to India in 1975, Charles met Canadian Marie Andre, or Monique, who at the time was dating a different man. He seduced her, she fell in love with him, leaving her current boyfriend, and eventually Charles asked her to leave Canada and move to Bangkok with him. Here, Charles gave her the identity of Monique. Monique knew of his murders and of his philandering with other women, but she chose not to speak. In notes she wrote in her personal diary, she spoke of the conflict she felt between being Marie-Andre and Monique. Marie-Andre was an innocent young girl that had moved across the world for love. Monique was an accomplice to murder. She felt torn, guilty, but her love for Charles felt all-consuming. It was a love she wasn't willing to let go of, even if it came at the cost of other people's lives. If there was one person who had the power to stop the killing spree before it got too late, it was Marie-Andre. But Marie-Andre was dead, and Monique was unwilling to speak up. The Canadian cops take in this story Charles's mother told them, and they narrate it all back to Herman. Herman had tried to move on from this story during his 3-week-long leave. Charles was out and the story was done. When the embassy doesn't help you and the cops don't help you and you begin to lose your mental peace and marriage to the stress, you know it's time to stop, even though you know countless young children were killed for nothing. But this story by the Canadian cops compelled Herman right back into the life of Charles. Herman meets up with Nadine that very day and realizes that Nadine had also been trying to move on. She tells Herman that Charles and Monique left Bangkok, and for the last few times she met them, there was no sign of Ajay. Nadine also tells Herman that Charles's landlord had planned to rent out Kanith House to new tenants and throw out everything that belonged to him. Obviously, neither Herman nor Nadine wanted this to happen. That house was a crime scene for the murders of perhaps the most notorious serial killer the world has ever seen. Crucial evidence could be lost if the police didn't raid the apartment soon. And so Herman pulled every string he could, exploited every high-profile diplomatic contact he had, and rallied a team of investigators and cops that descended down on the Kanith house. It was, quote, seedy and filthy, Herman described decades after the raid. They found 5 kilograms of medicine inside the house and 3 industrial-sized cartons of liquid containing a drug that acted as both a laxative and a chemical straitjacket, said Herman. They also found Cornelia's coat and handbag inside the house. After this raid, the Dutch ambassador, who had tried hard to convince Herman to drop this case, told him to share the story with the press. According to CNN, quote, within days, the Bangkok Post printed an explosive front-page story headlined Web of Death. After that, the Thai authorities took notice. They issued an Interpol notice, end quote. It was this Interpol notice that broke the case. Now, this is a fun fact, but I'm kind of an Interpol fan. These people are incredible. For those of our listeners that don't know, Interpol is the International Criminal Police Organization, which is an international organization that facilitates worldwide police cooperation and crime control. For those of you who've seen Don't Fuck with Cats, it was Interpol that caught the killer in the end. If any of you have seen The Tinder Swindler, it was the Interpol that caught the con man. For Charles Sobhraj, Interpol was going to mark the end of an era of murder on the hippie trail. By the time Interpol got notice of Charles and his murders, he was already in France, on the run yet again. But something was different this time. He was making international headlines. He was all over the news, not just in Bangkok, but also in Europe. It seemed like the possibility of continuing to run became harder and harder. But one country was still left, where he thought nobody would know who he was. India. By the end of 1976, Charles and Marie-Andre ran to New Delhi. What the couple didn't know yet was that there was an international arrest warrant against Charles, who had managed to colossally piss off the Indian police that wanted to catch him alive. Charles returned to India and all through the rest of 1976 continued to murder in India. He killed an Israeli man in Varanasi and a French tourist in Delhi. He drugged an entire tour group of French youngsters in attempts to rob them. When this tour group robbery went wrong, Charles was finally arrested in India. Found not guilty for the killing of the Israeli in Varanasi and the French tourist in Delhi, he was found guilty for the drugging and attempted robbery of the entire tour group and sentenced to India's most notorious prison, Tihar jail. Marie-Andre was sent to Tihar with Charles for her part in these crimes. However, she continued to deny any knowledge of the murders till the very end.
Actually, a little known fact about Sobhraj's time at the Tihar jail is that he continued to be this cunning, manipulative individual even in Tihar. So much so that he had firstly bribed all the Tihar officials and he had his own luxury wing equipped with a television, he had a phone, he used to get great food in separate quarters at Tihar. But also it's here where he befriended one of the most notorious terrorists in the world, Maulana Azhar, the same man responsible for the Kandahar attack, the 26/11 attacks, the Parliament attacks. It was here that he befriended him, and it was actually Sobhraj that lent Azhar his phone to call operatives in Kashmir to figure out whatever they were doing. So Azhar owed Sobhraj a favor.
Right.
In 1999, when the Kandahar hijacking happened, the Indian government actually reached out to Sobhraj saying, you think you can help us out here with figuring out the whole other situation? They never went through with the help. But to think that this man continued to be Charles Sobhraj, to continue to be Alain Gauthier, even in India's most gruesome prisons, bewilders me.
What a weird Desi crime crossover. And just this man's personality needed to be studied. what the hell? So now Aryaan and Monique were both in prison while Monique continued to deny any crime on her part. According to Women's Health magazine, even though she was sentenced to life in prison in India, this ruling was later overturned after she was diagnosed with terminal ovarian cancer and was allowed to return to Canada in 1983. She died on April 20th, 1984. She was only 38 years old. While the love of his life was on her deathbed, Charles was using his charm and wit and persona to be treated better than any other inmate inside, like Aryaan said, what is one of the most understaffed and overcrowded and notorious prisons in the world. According to Sunil Gupta, a former superintendent and legal officer at Tihar, he confirms what Aryaan said. Charles enjoyed special privileges, including food made according to his preference and conjugal visits not usually afforded to inmates. Quote, prisoners were supposed to stay in their wards, but he would roam around freely, said Gupta, who is the author of Black Warrant, Confessions of a Tihar Jailer, which is a memoir of his more than 30 years working at the Delhi prison. A CNN article mentions, quote, Sobhraj earned money by drafting court petitions for wealthy inmates and then maintained his elevated status by bribing guards. He was also said to have made secret recordings of senior prison officials that would implicate them in corruption. Quote, everyone was scared of him, Gupta said. In 1984, Bangkok-based journalist Alan Dawson travelled to India to interview Charles in Tihar. Quote, Tihar was an eye-opener to me. The prisoners ran life inside the walls and bars, and the authorities handled the paperwork and so on. Even by those standards, Charles was a bit of a revelation. He had a suite of 3 cells, and the prison ward called him Mr. Charles. From the very start, it was obvious to me that Charles was a con man, seeking control of the situation. He was a good-looking guy and had that swindler's knack of making you believe you were the center of his attention, end quote. 2 years after the interview with Alan Dawson, on March 17, 1986, Sobhraj committed perhaps his most impressive escape yet. Sunil Gupta, the superintendent at Tihar, tells CNN that, quote, he was watching a movie at home when a breaking news announcement cut in. Sobhraj had escaped from jail. Gupta hurried to the prison where he found a shocking scene. All the gatekeepers were asleep. Sobhraj had thrown a big party for the inmates and the guards for his 42nd birthday. He had offered all of them sweets, which were obviously laced with sedatives. As a consequence, more than a dozen prisoners escaped. Sobhraj had just a few weeks to go until his release from Tihar. So why? Why would he run away like this, risking an increased sentence on account of his escape? Because an increased sentence was exactly what Charles wanted. If he wouldn't have escaped, he would have been out of Tihar in a few weeks, making him eligible for extradition to Thailand, where murder charges, especially so many murder charges, are punishable by death. Sobhraj would have almost certainly been given the death penalty if he got extradited. But if he got his India sentence increased by running away and getting caught, the statute of limitations on his Thai murders would expire. A statute of limitations is basically a time period after which a government cannot hold accountable a criminal. In Thailand, that period was 20 years. While Charles was on the run in India after his prison escape, Herman Knippenberg was in the United States, getting his master's degree in public administration from Harvard University, when his phone rang. It was his program advisor calling him. Quote, I think you should go underground for the time being, she told him. Sobhraj has escaped from Tihar jail, and I think your life might be in danger, end quote. Herman didn't believe Charles was stupid enough to go after him all of these years later and risk entering the United States. And Herman was right. Charles was nowhere near Harvard University. He was in Goa, sipping a beer at the Coconut Tree restaurant to celebrate his 42nd birthday when he was caught. Quote, he didn't say anything. He went quite coolly, said the owner of the Coconut Tree. And it makes sense why he went coolly. He wanted to be in prison in India so he wouldn't be sent back to Thailand. His prison sentence was extended, the statute of limitations expired, and Charles Sobhraj, the most notorious serial killer in Thai history, can now never be charged in that country for the countless people he killed on its soil. On 17 February 1997, when Charles was 52 years old, he was released with most warrants, evidence, and even witnesses against him long lost. Without any country to extradite him to, Indian authorities let him return to France. In France, Sobhraj lived a life most people dream of. He lived in a nice suburban house in Paris. He was paid hordes of money for interviews and photographs. He sold the rights to a movie on his life for over 15 million US dollars. But if you know anything about Charles by now, you know this is not what he likes. He likes the attention, the thrill, the chase. He loves the idea of poking at the authorities and getting away with it. It reinforces his own belief in his intellect. And so, in 2003, he traveled to the one country where he could still be arrested, Nepal. According to the Himalayan Times, he had returned to Kathmandu on the pretense of wanting to set up a mineral water business. A few days after arriving, he was spotted by a journalist for the Himalayan Times in a casino in Kathmandu. The journalist followed in Sobhraj's steps for 2 weeks and wrote a news report in the Himalayan Times with photographs of him. The Nepalese police saw this published report, raided the casino Sobhraj used to frequent, and arrested him, who was still gambling there. The police reopened the Nepal double murder case from 1975. You all remember Laurent Carrier and Connie Jo Bronzik, the two young kids that Charles had killed and then stolen passports from? This was the case that Nepal reopened. The district court in Kathmandu sentenced Charles to life in prison, all because of Herman. How Herman? I'll get to that in a minute. But before that, let's get to perhaps the biggest question one can ask about this case. Why? For petty traveler's checks and fake passports? For power and infamy? Why would he do this? Was he just a straight-up psychopath? Journalist Alan Dawson, who had interviewed Charles in Tihar, kept coming back to this question. Why? This case was never a whodunit, it was always a whydunit. Sobhraj has himself never given a convincing answer to this question. Dawson said, quote, well, he never had a good answer. He implied that if I was going to write a book on him, then the answer would be that all these white people had corrupted and ruined Asia by trafficking opium.
Nonsense.
And therefore, his reasoning was that today's white people deserved to die for it, end quote. But Dawson knows that's not the true reason. To find the motive is why I went to Delhi to see him. And here I am more than 35 years later and still have no real clue, he said. After Alan Dawson, another big journalist interviewed Charles, Oz Magazine's Richard Neville. Neville said, quote, I had a crude theory of Charles as a child of colonialism revenging himself on the counterculture. Instead, I was dazzled by a brilliant psychopath, end quote. According to Neville, whenever he asked Sobhraj why he committed the crimes, he said he never killed good people and drew from psychoanalysis, global politics, and Buddhism to create a cozy world of rationalization and extenuating circumstances to justify his crimes. His claims that his life was a protest against the French legal system or that his love for Vietnam and Asia motivated his criminal career are absurd, but as tools of psychological manipulation, they are very effective, end quote. When Neville asked Sobhraj what makes a murderer, Sobhraj replied, either they have too much feeling and cannot control themselves, or they have no feelings at all. It is one of the two. He never said which one of the two applied to him. It's been 50 years since Charles committed his first murder, but even today, how many people he truly killed is unrevealed. 12 are confirmed, but the numbers could go as high as 30. When asked how many people he has robbed and stolen from, he says that the number is somewhere in the hundreds. I cannot end this episode in good conscience without telling you where all the people in this story are today. What are they doing? How have their lives moved on? Charles Sobhraj, the anti-hero of this tale, was in a prison in Nepal till 2022, having undergone multiple heart surgeries and in poor health. His love, Marie-Andre, is long dead and probably a distant memory in his mind. I wonder how often he thinks of her, if he thinks of her at all. But Sobhraj is currently married. In 2008, while in prison, Sobhraj announced of his engagement to a Nepali woman named Nihita Biswas, who eventually also was a Big Boss contestant.
The hell?
I know. The authenticity of their relationship has been confirmed. The two are in fact in love and married. Nihita Biswas stands by her husband's innocence, claiming none of these courts in any of these countries had enough evidence to convict Charles. I find it hard to feel hate, even for some of the worst killers we've covered. I feel bad for the mess inside their brains, not hate. But for Nihita Biswas, I cannot help but feel a strong internal hate, and I have no idea why. Herman Knippenberg, the first hero of our story, was in Wellington, New Zealand in 2003, having woken up to his first day of retirement when he gets a call from a friend. Sobhraj, who had been living in France, had just been arrested in Nepal and charged with the 1975 murder of the tourist couple in Kathmandu. Just like to everyone else, Sobhraj's decision to travel to Kathmandu was a curious choice to Herman too. Nepal was the only place in the world where he was still a wanted man. Under questioning from Nepalese police, Sobhraj denied he had ever previously visited Nepal. But Knippenberg knew he remembered something about Nepal. He ran down to his garage where there were 6 boxes of documents related to the Sobhraj case. He pulled out the statements made by and letters written by Marie-Andre or Monique through the course of her relationship with Sobhraj. In multiple of those, she had described in detail the time she spent in Nepal with him. He sent those documents to the FBI. Quote, I think it goes too far to say that I was directly responsible for his conviction in Nepal, though my efforts indicated to Nepal police what there was and where to look for it. End quote. According to CNN, when Knippenberg reflects on the case that absorbed the better half of his life, he, also 79, believes it got under his skin because he saw injustice. I was confronted with a situation in which innocent people were losing their lives and nobody lifted a finger, he said. I saw that as the complete failure of democracy. End quote. Herman now permanently lives in New Zealand and is 79 years old. To my disappointment and to the disappointment of many, Herman and Angla divorced in 1989. Today, Angla Knippenberg is Angla Kane and is happily married to an American man. She remains a successful diplomat with the United Nations and is the VP of the International Institute for Peace. Herman remarried too and has a happy, loving relationship with his wife. I wonder if, had Herman never received that letter from Cornelia's brother-in-law, would the couple still be together today? Nadine and Remy, the other two heroes of our story, continued to live in Thailand for many years after Charles and Marie-Andre fled the country. They chose to live private lives after that, rarely speaking of the events that had transpired. The two eventually returned to France and again, to my disappointment, got divorced years later. Dominique Ranello is safely back in France, where he had to start his life from scratch. According to an article by Screen Rant, quote, though he rarely talks about Charles Sobhraj and what happened to him all of those years ago, he has spoken briefly about his experiences in the past, shedding some light on what it was like for him during those months in Bangkok. He eventually met his wife, Teresa, in France and became a father. He now has two grown-up children of his own. According to the interview, Ranello is now the treasurer of the local billiards club in his hometown, where he organizes billiards competitions and is said to take the role very seriously. End quote. Ajay Chaudhary, Charles's right-hand man, mysteriously disappeared before the couple fled Bangkok. Many believe he too was one of the couple's victims. There have been some sightings of him in Germany, but none of them have been confirmed. And with that, you all, we reach the end of this mammoth case. Charles is alive and married too, which is not a terrible fate for someone who killed 12 and possibly 30 young people just on a journey to figure their lives out. He has support in his wife and lawyers who fought tooth and nail to get him out of prison, and out he is. As of the 23rd of December 2022, 19 years after he was arrested, the Supreme Court of Nepal ordered his release because he was almost 80 years old. Upon his release, though, the country kicked him out and deported him to France. From everything we know, there seems to be no remorse in the heart of this man for the crimes he's committed. Is this enough justice for the families that lost so much? Is this enough justice to those who escaped, like Dominique? Is this enough justice for us to do as society? I don't know. What I do know is that Charles Sobhraj isn't the rare case of a crazy psychopath. History has and will continue to see others like him, which is why we always say, stay safe, stay crazy, and stay Desi. If you like what we do here at Desi Studios and absolutely love what we're wearing today, this is merch you can go buy all for yourself.
You can buy this Desi Crime merch in our YouTube store on the link down below at Karak Merch. Keep the engines at Desi Studios rolling so we can pay our videographer right behind the camera to make these amazing episodes just for you.